This incident takes place on a chilly morning of January 4th, 2020, just a few days after New Year's Eve. An experienced cave diver named Simon Halliday was preparing for a solo dive in Lancaster Hole, one of the entrances to the Easgill system. The entrance is a vertical shaft, dropping straight down into the darkness. However, at 49 years old, Simon was no stranger to extreme adventures. He loved to push himself to the limits. As he prepared for his dive, Simon methodically checked his equipment. His rebreather was a centerpiece of his gear. This device would allow him to stay underwater far longer than traditional scuba equipment, recycling his breath and removing carbon dioxide. Simon's plan was ambitious. He intended to dive through the initial sump and then explore passages nearly a kilometer beyond. This area, 900 meters past the sump pool, was at the frontier of exploration in the Easgill system. Few divers had ventured so far, and there was always the possibility of discovering new passages. The weather on the surface was typical for a January day in northern England, cold, damp, and overcast. But this had little bearing on conditions underground. However, recent rains had increased the water flow into the cave. As Simon got his gear ready, his friends David and Kevin looked on with a mix of excitement and concern. He told them he'd be back in 3 hours, 4 at the most. With a final thumbs up, Simon disappeared into the murky water. Little did he know, he was diving straight into his death. Hours passed, and the quiet hillside showed no signs of Simon's return. As the 4th hour came and went, David and Kevin's concern turned to alarm. Something had gone wrong. They quickly alerted the authorities, setting in motion one of the most challenging cave rescues in recent memory. Soon, the quiet countryside was swarming with rescuers. Cave divers, police, and members of the Cave Rescue Organization rushed to the scene. Among them was Anthony Seddon, an expert rescue diver. Anthony plunged into the underwater passage, fighting against the unusually strong current. 14 minutes into his dive, about 60 meters from the entrance, he made a grim discovery. There was Simon, motionless in the water. When they brought Simon's body to the surface, rescuers noticed something disturbing. The oxygen supply pipe from his breathing equipment appeared to be disconnected or torn out. But had this happened during the dive or while they were retrieving him? The answer wasn't clear. As investigators pieced together Simon's final moments, a tragic picture emerged. It seemed his specialized breathing equipment, called a rebreather, had failed him underwater. The device was still in development and not available to the public. Simon had been testing it for a company called Sump UK. When the rebreather stopped working, Simon would have switched to his backup air supply. But in the strong current, fighting to stay down and conserve air, he likely used up his remaining oxygen too quickly. In those dark, lonely waters, Simon Halliday had drowned, just a short distance from safety. The caving community was devastated. Simon's wife Toni said his death left a huge hole in our hearts. The coroner ruled it a case of misadventure, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong in the unforgiving world of cave diving. This incident takes place in November 2021. We're now in Wales, in the rugged landscape of the Brecon Beacons. Here lies another remarkable cave system, Ogof Finnindhi, or Cave of the Black Spring. This underground labyrinth is a paradise for experienced cavers seeking adventure. One such caver was George Linnane, a 38-year-old engineer from Bristol. Like Simon Halliday, George was no novice. He'd been exploring caves for years and knew the risks involved. On November 6th, he set out with a small group for what was supposed to be a 6-hour trip into Ogof Finnindhi. Their plan was for a 6-hour trip, a relative routine excursion for experienced cavers like George. They entered through the Cwm Dwr entrance, one of several ways into the vast system. But about 500 meters from one of the exits, disaster struck. George lost his footing and fell nearly 30 feet onto the hard cave floor. The impact was devastating. George broke his arm, jaw, and several ribs. He dislocated his collarbone, lacerated his spleen, and collapsed a lung. As he lay there in excruciating pain, he thought his caving days, and perhaps his life, were over. One of George's friends raced to the surface to call for help, while another stayed by his side, talking to him for hours to keep him conscious. News of the accident spread quickly through the caving community. Within hours, an unprecedented rescue operation was underway. Nearly 300 volunteers from across the UK converged on the Welsh mountainside. This wouldn't be a simple rescue. Moving George out of the cave presented enormous challenges. Many of the passages were too narrow for a standard stretcher. Rescuers had to use a special, flexible stretcher, carefully maneuvering it through tight squeezes and over difficult terrain. Rescuers had to work in shifts, carefully moving George inch by inch through the twisting tunnels. They had to pause frequently to treat his injuries and swap out exhausted team members. As the hours turned into days, George drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain was constant, but the presence of the rescuers gave him hope. Above ground, the rescue effort transformed the quiet hillside into a bustling command center. Cavers from every corner of Britain were there, ready to lend a hand. Local people brought food and hot drinks for the tired rescuers. Inside the cave, progress was painstakingly slow. Rescuers formed human chains, passing George's stretcher from person to person through the narrowest sections. They rigged ropes to haul him up vertical shafts and floated him across underground pools. After more than 2 full days underground, George finally saw a glimmer of light. As rescuers carried him out of the cave entrance, he was greeted by cheers and applause from the crowd that had gathered. George emerged into the night air at 7:45 p.m. on November 8th, 54 hours after his ordeal began. Battered and exhausted, but alive. It was the longest cave rescue in Welsh history, and the second longest ever carried out in the UK. As he was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital, where doctors marveled at his survival, despite his severe injuries, George's spirit remained unbroken. In the weeks that followed, as George recovered in the hospital, he had time to reflect on his brush with death. But rather than turning him away from caving, the experience only strengthened his passion for the sport. George was so moved by the efforts of his rescuers that he decided to join their ranks. He signed up to volunteer with the South and Mid Wales Cave Rescue Team, the very group that had saved his life.